Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to our webinar on givinostat, which we're putting out live on the evening of Thursday, the 19th of December, and it's also being recorded. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Emily Rubin, and I'm one of the founders and the CEO of Duchenne UK, and we will be starting the meeting now. Alex, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Alex Johnson. I'm the co-founder of Joining Jack and Duchenne UK. I'm actually joined tonight by my son Jack, who is now 16, almost 17, and has actually been part of the givinostat clinical trial for the past 4.5 years. Jack actually wanted to join us tonight because we've been absolutely blown away by the support that we've received from the community in allowing him to tell his story and join this campaign. So thank you from us.
Thanks so much, Alex, and thanks for joining us, Jack. So we're sorry you can't all see each other, but there are so many people on this webinar. It's the most who've ever signed up to one of these. And in some ways, it's not surprising because I think it's not an understatement to say that this is a huge moment for the Duchenne muscular dystrophy community in the UK. Only last week, NICE made a decision on vamorolone, making it available for patients in the UK. And now, for the first time in our history in the UK, we're within touching distance of a second treatment that's also been shown to slow down disease progression. It's not a cure. It's not going to be transformative in the way that some recently approved medicines for other rare diseases like SMA, spinal muscular atrophy, have been. But it's a start. We launched our Time is Muscle campaign 6 weeks ago, because for patients who are living with Duchenne, it's brutal and relentless, and slowing down disease progression is a major step forward. And as Alex said, the energy and outpouring of support from the community is testament to how big this need is. So there are two things going on that we're going to talk about tonight. Firstly, there's the campaign to get givinostat approved by the regulators who approve new medicines in the UK, and that's the MHRA, the Medicines Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency. They're currently considering whether or not to approve givinostat and for whom. In March, the FDA in the USA approved givinostat for all boys, regardless of whether or not they could walk. And that was despite the fact that the clinical trial was run only in ambulant boys. Now, following Brexit, the MHRA introduced something called IRP, the International Recognition Procedure, which gave them the powers to mirror decisions that were made in other countries. So in other words, they could simply follow the FDA and give a broad label approval. So approve givinostat for boys, whether or not they can walk. In April, we put an article in the Daily Mail about this, highlighting the urgent desire by patients to see this happen and to plead with the regulators to show flexibility and approve the drug for ambulant and non-ambulant patients. And we know that the MHRA is hearing your voices because more than 200 of you have written to them asking the agency to show flexibility and compassion in giving givinostat a broad label. So thank you to everyone who wrote into the MHRA, and we do expect a decision from them anytime soon. So the second area that we're going to touch on tonight, and which is the main focus of this webinar, is the EAP, the Early Access Programme. So at the moment, givinostat is an unlicensed product, which means it hasn't yet been approved by the MHRA. And we're going to be hearing from Dr. Mansour from GOSH about the specifics of the EAP in a moment. But Alex and I just wanted to thank him by giving up his time to present tonight, and also for all the work he's putting in to get the EAP set up at GOSH. But first, I wanted to highlight the incredible work both of my co-founder, Alex, and Hassan Jack, and the team at Duchenne UK, but most of all to you, our incredible community of parents fighting not just for their children, but for all children. You know, there are parents like me for whom their sons are no longer walking, so they do not qualify for the EAP. They do not fit the strict criteria, but nevertheless, they took the time out to write to their trusts and to write to their MPs. And this is really true advocacy for ourselves and for our community. And Alex and I will be eternally grateful to you all. And the impact that we as a community are having is undeniable. And you've all been absolutely amazing. I've just put together a short slide here, and I'm going to pick out a few highlights. So on the 15th of November, Duchenne UK wrote a letter to the community, letting you all know about the EAP. And we also wrote to the CEOs of each of the trusts in the North Star network, asking them to support their clinicians in whatever way they needed to open up the EAP. By week 3, we had confirmation that 19 sites were in talks to set up the EAP. And then we were asking you all to write to your MPs and hospital sites as well. And now, nearly 6 weeks into our campaign, 25 sites are in talks or in the process of setting up the EAP. And you've all been so busy engaging more than 30 politicians, including one member of the cabinet. We've got some breaking news to share with you tonight, and that is that on the 22nd of January, we will be hosting a parliamentary event. So we will be letting you all know what you need to do to invite your MPs and come along to that. And here's just a summary of how the community has been pulling together. So here's Joey Levine meeting his local MP, Christian Wakeford. Jill and Richard Binns, whose son Jack has Duchenne, got their MP, Afra Brandreth, to send a question to the Department for Health and Social Care. And Alex Clark, whose son Ben has DMD, was on BBC Radio Oxford and got his MP to send a question to the Secretary of State for Health and Social Care. And Alex and her son Jack met the Culture Secretary, Lisa Nandy MP, to discuss the EAP. Alex and Jack asked her to raise this issue with her cabinet colleagues and, most importantly, the Secretary of State for Health and Social Care, Wes Streeting. So I'm going to pause here to hand over to Will, our head of policy, for a short update on what happens next.
Hello all. In this slide, I just want to give you an idea of the timeline for what's going to happen on the regulatory approval for givinostat. Now, Dr. Manzoor will also touch upon this in his presentation as well. But I want to give you a sense of there are a series of hurdles that givinostat has to clear before it can be approved for use in the NHS. The first hurdle is the MHRA. It has to be licensed by the MHRA. That decision will be made first. We're hoping for a decision by January. After that, NICE will then finish its appraisal of givinostat. They will be meeting in May 2025 to discuss and vote on givinostat. A few weeks later after that, they will publish a recommendation. And this is when all the timelines start to get a bit fuzzy. But assuming that NICE does approve givinostat and it all goes smoothly, no longer than 3 months afterwards, it has to be provided in clinic in the NHS. So potentially that could be by the end of 2025. What I want to leave you with here is, while yes, potentially access by the end of 2025 through routine access in the NHS, givinostat is in theory available now through the EAP. And then this is why we've been pushing for uptake and adoption of the EAP as soon as possible for everyone who's eligible, because then people who are eligible for the EAP don't have to wait until the end of 2025 to be able to get access to givinostat. I also wanted to touch upon how you can get involved. For people who have signed up to our newsletter, these will be very familiar. People who aren't signed up to our newsletter, please do sign up. But if you haven't already, write to your local NHS trust and make the case to them for why you think your local neuromuscular clinic should be taking part in the early access programme, and make a case for why they should be given the resources and ability to do so. We are hoping that the NHA will do a broad label to givinostat, write to them and then to Dr. Jean Rain, the CEO of the NHA, and explain why. Also, write to your MP. Tell them why this is important and ask them to make representations on your behalf to parts of health and social care, and of course, post about this on social media. For the first of those three, writing to your trust, the NHA and the MP, you can find template letters on our website to help give you an idea of the sort of thing you should say to them. And so at this point, I'll now hand over to Dr. Manzoor.
While Dr. Manzoor's getting his slides up, I just wanted to remind everybody that if you want to ask a question, do just write it in the chat and we will have time for questions at the end.
Thanks very much, Will. Can you please confirm that you can see my screen?
Yes, I can see your screen.
Thank you. Thanks very much. So it's a privilege to be with you and share where we are with givinostat from the clinical context. My name is Adnan Manzoor. I'm one of the neuromuscular consultants at Great Ormond Street Hospital, London. I also am one of the leads for North Star Network, trying to coordinate the care of Duchenne up and down the country. So today we wanted to talk about practicalities and challenges. In the main, we will talk about givinostat. That's the fuller discussion. I will probably talk for about 10 to 15 minutes. But I think you're all probably aware that NICE has just published their initial recommendation for vamorolone, which is another steroid which will be the replacement or the option for replacement for deflazacort and prednisolone. NICE will publish their final recommendation at the end of January 2025, and then there are 3 months to implement it. So what we say about givinostat, there may be some practical arrangements for each family as to what is the best treatment to be put in first and what goes in second. But that's a slightly different discussion. I just wanted to acknowledge that this is a parallel progress that is happening. So some of this a little bit of repetition. MHRA regulatory approval of givinostat was expected in January/February 25. It probably is very close. Once that happens, then they will issue what is called summary of product characteristics. This is the information leaflet that comes inside each medical bag. It gives the doctors and the pharmacists indications of how to prescribe, what side effects to look for. It also gives parents the information what to look out for. The NICE meeting is in May 25. Ital Pharmaco is the manufacturing pharmaceutical company which makes givinostat. They have got givinostat. They tell me that they have got givinostat in their UK warehouse now. To do that, they need approval of MHRA, and that they tell me they have. At the moment, givinostat does not have a license for use till the MHRA approval happens. The special circumstances of it being beneficial has allowed it to be provided through this special arrangement called Early Access Program. NHS England uses the term medicine free of charge because they have an approach to how medicines free of charge should be implemented in the NHS. The givinostat EAP information, its program is live, but you as families and I as a clinician cannot search it on in the internet and find it. And I understand the reason for this is that the pharmaceuticals legally cannot advertise it at this stage because it's a specialized arrangement. They're not allowed to be seen pushing something before they have got a license. And the company has indicated that the givinostat EAP recruitment, patients joining it, they say that they will keep it open till NICE makes a recommendation, and there's a way of funding to happen on NICE. The company has created a special portal on the internet where the clinicians and the hospitals who may wish to provide this medication can log themselves and get the relevant information. Now, the North Star clinicians, that is the doctors and therapists and nurses and pharmacists in the neuromuscular centers which look after young people with Duchenne, they have been thinking along these lines to say, what is the evidence that this drug works? The dosing and monitoring, should it mirror the clinical trial arrangements? They've been asking, what are the resources required to gain approval from their trust, to select the patients, to prioritize, get informed consent, write the prescriptions, do the monitoring, do the dose adjustments. Then there's the question, should we wait for NICE recommendations? Will NHS England finally provide some more reimbursement for a resource? And can doctors in the UK have a consensus about how to deal with EAP? There's additional questions of when you start a new medication, how do you collect the data to see how effective it is and how it's working? I put families' wishes and advocacy group, not that it comes down the list, but apart from the medical issues, this is also an issue of what the family's choices will be. And this is a recent item, the givinostat versus vamorolone. They are not mutually exclusive. Eventually, they will happen together. But I put this in here that when these treatments become available, there will be a practical question of, for a particular child, what may be the best change to happen first. I thought it was useful to just look at 2 or 3 slides from the main clinical trial. Now, some of you will be very, very familiar with this, and I apologize for that. But in the clinical trial, where they had the treatment group and a placebo or dummy medicine group, the inclusion criteria for that trial was that boys had to be 6 years and above. They had their 4-stair climb time. It should be 8 seconds or less. The time to rise from lying would have been between 3 seconds to 10 seconds, and they were required to be on stable corticosteroids for 6 months. For the clinical trial, it was important that they would have a range of severity which was broadly similar, and that the stability of steroid means that a change in steroid may make a difference, and that should not confuse the difference that happens because of givinostat. In this study, they also did MRI scans to see how much fat was there in the muscle. And the primary endpoint, the measure of success in the trial, was what happens to the 4-stair climb at the beginning of the study and at the end of the study. It was an 18-month or 72-week study. In the control trial, in the treatment trial, there were 77 boys who were selected to represent the narrow group, who would be compared with 37 boys who were on the dummy medicine or placebo group. And these 2 graphs picture what they found at the end. So the top graph here, which is called 4-stairs climb, the graph is from the paper. The blocks of data, they are my add-ons to make it a bit more easier to understand. So the blue line is the placebo group. The red line is the treatment group. And what it shows is, if you think of the group of patients or young boys who were treated with givinostat, how long did they take to climb 4 stairs? For example, it was 3 seconds on an average. And the whole group, how long was it at the end? And what was the difference between the end point and the beginning? That difference shows how much deterioration that happened, because increased time means increased difficulty in getting up 4 steps. And in that, what it shows is that the young people who were on placebo, their time to rise on an average went up by 2.89 seconds, whereas the boys who were on treatment, givinostat, their time went up only by 1.3 seconds. So there was some deterioration or some worsening, but less so in the givinostat group. This table makes it a bit easier. So I've got 4-stair climbing time. This column is baseline. What was the time of the group before starting treatment? This is 18 months, 72 weeks. What was the time? So in the placebo, at the beginning, it took them an average of 3.48 seconds to climb 4 stairs. At the end of the study, it took them 6.37 seconds. Whereas in givinostat, at the beginning, the time to rise was 3.39 seconds, time to go up 4 stairs. At the end of 18 months, it was 4.76. Now, that is significant difference in the first 18 months. And the thought is that if the drug is continued, then year on year, this gap may be bigger and the benefit from givinostat may become more obvious and more cumulative. Now, in addition to what they call the primary outcome measure or the 4 stairs, there were other things that were measured, and these includes how long it takes to walk 10 meters, a 6 minutes walk test, how long it takes to get up from the floor, and so forth. And all these measures, they seem to show some benefit in the favor of, or the evidence was for givinostat. Now, that is very good data and convinces people that this trial was successful, that givinostat seems to have worked. And because it is randomized controlled trial, you cannot quibble with this data. So the next question is, how well was the medicine tolerated? And were there any side effects? So again, these tables are from the paper. These red lines, I've annotated them to make them more obvious. There were two main adverse effects which required adjustment of dose of givinostat. One side effect was decreased platelet count. And you would remember platelets are very small cells in the blood which help our blood clot if we get a cut. If the platelets get very low, then we get bruising, and if we get a cut, then there's a hematoma or bleeding doesn't stop. So in the givinostat group, 31% of the patients had some decrease in platelet count. The second effect, it did not cause harm to anybody, but it required adjustment, and we'll come to that. The other adverse effect that was noted was triglycerides, which are one of the fat materials or lipids in the blood. They go up as a side effect of this medicine. So the triglycerides went up in 22%. That's roughly a quarter or a fifth of the treated group, givinostat group. There were some patients who had more diarrhea, more abdominal pain, so there were some tummy symptoms. Now the question that you would ask is, did some children need to stop the medicine because of side effects? So it says adverse effects or adverse events leading to treatment discontinuation. So there were 4 patients or 4 young people who needed to stop givinostat. That equates to 3% of the treated group. And they were mainly because of raised triglycerides or raised lipids. The second question is, how many young people needed an adjustment or reduction of their dose to deal with these adverse effects? So this is here, adverse events leading to dose reduction. So that was 36% of the givinostat treated group. So roughly 1/3 of the treated boys, they required adjustment of the dose. As we said, what amount of work do we need to do to get this treatment in place? So in the North Star database, when we looked about 8 weeks, 6 weeks ago, we had 566 boys registered who are walking, and there were 147 boys who seemed to fit the inclusion criteria. So in the EAP, the Extended Access Program, the criteria that they put is that to be able to eligible to use this, the age should be 6 years and above, and young people need to be walking. They should be able to stand up from the floor from lying position in less than 10 seconds. And they should be on concurrent steroid treatment. There's some exclusion criteria as well. That's relatively simple. I think the important thing is that the participants who are in another clinical trial, because they're evaluating another drug, they may not be able to join the EAP at this stage. And if somebody has very high lipids or somebody has very severe heart involvement, that may be a different thing. But you can consider that a small print for now. This is a picture of what is called SMPC, Summary of Product Characteristics. So when a drug is given approval in every country, they have this, which legally they are supposed to put it with every bottle or with every pack of the medicine when it's sold. This is from United States. When MHRA gives the approval in UK, there will be a UK-specific summary of product characteristics. The fine-tuning of what dose of medicine, etc., this may change a little bit when the MHRA approval happens. But broadly, for the moment, we're expecting the same. So this is a table from the current protocol as the EAP recommends, that according to the weight, the dose of the givinostat changes with time. There are some very patient-friendly leaflets as well, which the company has. Once the EAP starts, they will be made available. But these groups, they may be simplified. Instead of 7, there may be 3 or 4 groups after the MHRA gives approval. Similar tables are available for how we do the dose reduction, because if there's an adverse effect like low platelets or high lipids, then the dose has to be decreased by 33%. Then the bloods are checked again. And if they still have not responded, then the dose is checked again. If there's still the problem persisting, then it may need discontinuation of the medication. But if the problem settles at a lower dose, then one stays with the lower dose. So I think now you would all feel frustrated why it's not happening. So these are what I would call practicalities, what we have to do at each trust. Now, when there's a medicine free of charge, each NHS trust has to look at it specifically from its own perspective, because they evaluate the risk of, and when they evaluate the risk, they says this is not a licensed product. If something goes wrong, who will be responsible? What is the insurance cover? If company pulls out, will we be able to provide this medicine? What will be the cost? And so on and so forth. So each trust has a committee called Drug and Therapeutics Committee or Drugs Committee. This committee approves a new medicine when it comes in. So to do that, the doctors and the pharmacists have to fill out some forms which are trust specific. So each trust has, DTC has to give approval. And part of that approval or parallel to that approval is how will the trust implement the sessions of consultations, the consenting, the blood test monitoring, and so forth. And then the consent forms have to be developed for each trust. They have to be seen by the trust solicitors, and it has to be made patient friendly and appropriate. So I think now the other practical arrangement is that, as you remember, the standard of care is that each young person with DMD should come to the clinic every 6 months as a minimum. So can we dovetail the management into those 6 monthly clinics? And we recognize that there may be some families or from young people who on the last assessment were taking 7 or 8 seconds to get up from the floor, or 9 seconds. And there's a worry that they may deteriorate quicker. So the clinicians in that center would look at their patient cohort and see, are there some patients that we somehow need to bring forward and check so that they do not miss the window of opportunity, so to say, to start the medicine. So those arrangements, how the young people are prioritized, that has to be made. Then ideally, we should be sending information to a family in advance of the clinic so that they know they are going to be seen, this is going to be discussed. And that arrangement needs to be made for that. You would remember that each clinic is a long consultation and you're there for the lot of the day. So how do we build in time for the discussion of EAP and informed discussion, not just a ticking exercise? We need to do the baseline blood test. And with the lipids, I hope there's not many parents here, but some of you may be aware that as one gets older and one has a lipid check, the doctors say you should check the lipids fasting. So ideally, the lipids should be tested fasting, which means before breakfast. So this arrangement needs to be made that either a few days before or on the day of the clinic, somehow the fasting blood tests are done. And ideally, an ECG should also be done, because in the animal experiments, if very high drugs or dosage was used, there was some abnormality on ECG called QTC. And there's some medicines which increase QTC. So if there's any worry about it, then it's useful to have a baseline ECG to make sure where things start from, and then along the line it can be checked again. Then there needs to be time made for review of the blood tests, writing the prescriptions. These prescriptions are not ordinary hospital prescriptions. There needs to be a dual set, one for the hospital, one has to be put on the portal of the company so that the drug can be released. As things stand today in the EAP, the blood test monitoring is recommended at 2 weeks, 4 weeks, 6 weeks, 8 weeks, 3 months, and then 6 monthly. And then if there's a adverse effect, one of the blood tests is abnormal, then it needs to be double checked to confirm the abnormality. And then the dose is reduced. So there may be more blood tests. I think at a minimum it was about 8 times a year, but if there's some side effects, there may be more. So I think people may say, look, we are the parents and we are the children, we will deal with this, which is absolutely fine. But I think the physicians and the hospital setup make the arrangements or need to make the arrangements that these things happen reliably. The results are collated. Where are they done? Local hospital or the tertiary hospital. The local hospitals are not part of EAP, so they may theoretically say we are not doing them, but we hope that they may have a different attitude. One of the important things that parents want to know and the doctors want to know and the trust want to know is that if for some reason theoretically MHRA doesn't give the approval or NICE doesn't make the recommendation or NICE and NHS England cannot agree a price with the company and the company refuses to provide the medicine, what is the arrangement? Those people who have started on EAP, what will happen? So the company is saying that those children that they start on EAP, if MHRA, UK government says we are not approving this drug, then they will stop the EAP for everybody. But otherwise, they will keep the medicine going till such time that NHS England gives the approval. These things are important to know, especially from the trust perspective, because not having the medication is a big problem if things don't go right. And there will be solicitors and contracts and so forth who will look into this. So implementation, I think we talked about paperwork, authorization. At the moment, NHS England has not released any funding. The company cannot give any funding legally. So we are trying to work on it. Exit strategy, I think there's some described and will work. Model of care. Model of care means should all this EAP care be done at your neuromuscular center? It may work for those families who live very close to a neuromuscular center. But now if the families live 60 miles away or 80 miles away, then it's a big imposition on them to have to travel all that distance for blood tests and so forth. So we have to work out how we can collaborate with local teams and have a system set up that a blood test can be run reliably at the right time. The blood test result is sent reliably. It is read. The consenting has to be done properly. I think we talked about blood tests, etc. We discussed this amongst the UK clinicians, and the North Star clinicians agree that treatment of DMD with givinostat should be given, but they were worried that we don't have the workforce and resource to implement this, and that we need to make arrangements for that. I think we talked about this, about how to get resource. And I think perhaps I lift this slide back at what is happening now in the UK. Now, there's a lot happening. Advocacy groups are fighting the battle. Parents are fighting the battle. Within the North Star centers where young people with Duchenne are seen, in most centers, practically all centers, the work that is happening is physicians, physiotherapists, and pharmacists, they have all become aware of this. They are in touch with the company and the portal, and they are looking at the information. They are in variable stages of registering the drug with the Drug and Therapeutics Committee. Some have registered. Some Drug and Therapeutic Committees say it is not wise to register a drug till MHRA approval is available. And some are developing the paperwork. Most of these trusts, they tell us that as things stand immediately, they do not have the resource to put it in place straight away, but they are costing how much would it take them to extra in terms of doctor's time, nurse practitioner's time, physiotherapy time, pharmacist time to each per patient and then per group. And they are going to ask their trust to allocate that money so that the things can be started. And we've had 3 meetings already. We are going to meet again towards the later part of January with the advocacy groups to see the progress and where we are. So I think this is what is happening. One of the things that we are still not certain about, because I think the parents' wish may be, because it is open, we want to access it as quickly as possible. Now, in some centers, there's about 10 eligible children. In some centers, there's 20. There's some centers between 25 and 35. So it needs a full consultation. It needs physiotherapy assessment to see them in addition to the regular Duchenne clinics is a big piece of work for which we don't have the resource available immediately. And we need to plan. So I think the models that we are thinking of is, one is prioritization of some patients who may lose the opportunity, who are weaker or taking between 8 or 10 seconds to rise from the floor, try to bring them forward, and the rest perhaps see in the cycle of 6 months. However, if a big resource was available, theoretically, we could have a possibility of extra clinics in which one tries to do that in 3 months rather than in 6 months. But I think these are possibilities. How it will happen, I think we are still trying to work on it, and it's resource dependent. So maybe I will shush and thank you for your patience. And I apologize that I've probably taken too long to talk. I'll stop sharing my screen.
And then absolutely no need to apologize. That was extremely comprehensive, very, very well presented and clear to everyone, I think. So really a big thank you from us. I'm just going to kick off with a couple of questions. We do have a lot of questions, but pertaining specifically to your presentation. Jagan Alu has asked, were there any deaths in the clinical trial because the fatal AEs were not visible
Not
on the slide?
reported.
No reported deaths. Okay. Another question from Jennifer Anderson. Is there any information that if boys have been dosed on a gene therapy trial, will they be eligible for the EAP? But if that trial is completed?
If the trial is completed, then I don't see any reason why not. If they are under some obligation not to use another new medication as a part of the arrangement of the trial, that may be different. But so the question would be, in general, people have questions about things like steroids, that is standards of care. Atalorin, it is at the moment standards of care in UK. So the clinicians will come around to the idea. Antisense oligonucleotides, that is a slightly different category. Those who are in active clinical trials of antisense oligonucleotide, I think because they're in a trial medication, it will be difficult. Those young people who are on compassionate use past the clinical trial antisense nucleotides, I think there will have to be a very careful discussion about it. It's not a very clear yes or no at the moment. I think those are the main medication at the moment. But specifically clinical trials which are ongoing, that may be difficult.
Okay, another question from Laura Godwin. If a child stops a clinical trial that they are part of, how long would they have to wash out before taking givinostat?
This has not been fully determined. Givinostat, they want us to use common sense with these things. So the physicians will evaluate from the previous study, were there any renal or cardiac or any adverse effects that can show up in the time period. Traditionally, the people have talked about 3-month washout period. But I think this again is one of those items of discussion. I think families will need to give very, very careful thought before they come out of a clinical trial, because some of them, they were very precious, desire to join that trial. Some trials may have a very long-term benefit. And also, EAP is a 3-month arrangement or 4-month. we are optimistic that this will become a clinically available drug. So it becomes a clinically available standard of care drug that may change the dynamic. The clinical trial people may have a different view because the tradition is standards of care medication should be allowed. So I think there will be a discussion about this before it gets resolved.
Okay. So just to clarify, by standards of care, you mean drugs that have been approved for use for Duchenne muscular dystrophy. So that includes cardiac medication, corticosteroids, which now includes prednisolone, deflazacort, and vamorolone. One question that came in from Marion Main, will the boys be taking steroids and givinostat or just givinostat?
I think the terms and conditions of EAP is that givinostat can only be given if they are on steroids. So people who are not steroids, as things stand today on EAP, they cannot use it because that was how the clinical trial worked. The two drugs are supposed to or thought to work in a slightly different pathway. So there's optimism that there will be a add-on benefit. I think it remains to be seen.
And let's say for those patients who can't tolerate corticosteroids, if givinostat does get approved, will they be able to take it even if they're not taking corticosteroids?
I think I'm hesitant to say immediate yes, but common sense will prevail. And the issue will be he's tolerated the medication. The other medication cannot be tolerated, give him the benefit. So I think the commonsensical clinical response will be yes. But, these things have to be discussed as a consensus. And then, then you say, yes, this is what we agreed. But the commonsensical view would be yes.
Adnan, I'm going to give you a very quick break, but please don't go away because I'm just going to come to Alex and Jack. And Jack, so you've been on the clinical trial of givinostat and you're on it now. What was it like for you being on that trial?
The trial for me, it was something that I was passionate about taking part in. The trial went quite well, didn't notice anything. I did have some side effects though, and that was going off some of my favourite foods, e.g. prawn cocktail. I know that sounds crazy, but that was one of my favourite foods, and I kind of went off that. And we also had a platelet count drop as well, but luckily there was no bruising with that. But apart from that, the trial seemed to have run quite smoothly, I'd say.
Thanks for that, Jack. There was a question about the groups that had the doses adjusted. So if they had an adverse event and they had their doses adjusted, did those patients who had the dose reduced, did they still show an improvement in their 4-stair climb, or do we not have that sort of level of detail?
We don't have that. They did not publish that detail, but I think one remains optimistic that it was beneficial because as a group, they benefited.
Okay, thanks. That's really helpful. And Vasundra's got a question. In comparison to Translarna, how different and efficient is givinostat?
Right. I think the head-to-head comparison is not there. One would have to impute and compare. I think the way the outcome measure in Etelorin was 6-minute walk distance. I think in this paper, I would have to analyze. On first reading, I think the markers of benefit are more impressive in givinostat because you've got the primary outcome measure which got better and all the other outcome measures are in one direction. When you look at the Etelorin papers, I think for those of you who have a long memory, it took quite a lot of statistical work to work out the benefit for a subgroup of patients. So I think on the face of it, this appears from the paper that is published to be more effective or impressive.
So are you saying that if you look at the papers published of givinostat, the trial met all of its endpoints, whereas with Atalurin, did they meet any of their endpoints, or did they only meet some of them, or was it just a case that they investigated the data and found that it was only potentially effective for a small group?
I think a clinician has to be very careful making a statement without thoroughly going back and reviewing the data. I think you would remember that in Etaloren, what they showed was that at the end of this study, the children who were treated with the middle dose, on an average, they deteriorated 30 meters less in 6-minute walk distance as compared to the group who were not treated. So I think that's all that I would say at the moment. I think scientifically, one would have to pull the data out of the 6-minute walk distance from this study, try to compare it with the other. I think we've not got.
We haven't. Yeah, that is a challenging piece of data analysis. There's an interesting question here from Ryan. Regarding the secondary outcome measures, could Adnan please comment on givinostat's effect on muscle MRI fat fraction? Also, is there any evidence for givinostat to reduce CK myoglobin?
I think when I looked at the paper, I don't remember CK or myoglobin to be reported as such. And then when you look at the last item here is MRS and MRS fat fraction, it wasn't statistically significant, but whatever benefit was there, it was in the favor of givinostat.
There's so many questions. I'm really sorry. I'm just trying to.
Yeah.
Lots and lots of questions. Here's a question from Michelle. Can a child start, and you did allude to this in your presentation, Adnan, about the fact that we're in a situation now where vamorolone was approved last week and we're waiting, to hear news from the MHRA about givinostat. But can a child start vamorolone and givinostat at the same time?
Yeah. So I think the caution here is 1/3 of the young people who start givinostat will have an adverse effect. So the general principle is medicine is that if you start 2 drugs at the same time, if there's an adverse effect, it is difficult to ascribe it to one drug or the other. Now, if platelets go down or lipids go high, I think the predominant inference would be that it's because of givinostat, but one cannot be certain. If there's a rash that happens after starting 2 drugs, then you would not know what is that rash from. If there's severe diarrhea or severe vomiting, you would not be able to tell. So traditionally, what clinicians have advocated is that you start one drug, especially look at the side effects, give it a period in which the side effects usually declare themselves, and then start the second medication. Theoretically, one could say that if there's a benefit, you still don't know which one to ascribe to. That's easier because in clinical context, somebody says, I want benefit. I don't want to know which one is getting the benefit. But in practice, I think at the moment when clinicians are talking to each other, the thought was perhaps we should move it at least 2 months apart. I think we'll have to go back to the data. I've not looked at the data of timing of the givinostat adverse effects, whether all the thrombocytopenia and all the increased lipid, whether it happened within the first 2 months of starting treatment or within the first 3 months or longer. I think that data needs to be reviewed. I have not reviewed that data. That may inform us trying to say how long we should suggest the gap is between the two. So, Emily, you're muted.
Thank you for that. There's a comment here from Rosemary Reed saying that she doesn't think travel distance from a site should be considered as a factor. She's 60 miles from a hospital, but would travel to the moon if needed. And it should be up to parents to decide what a reasonable travel time is, not doctors. One question from Sarika, is it okay to stop givinostat? I mean, I think what they're saying is it okay to start it and then stop it if the MHRA will not approve? And I guess that's alluding to what happens if you potentially start and stop steroids, but it's a different situation here, isn't it?
Yeah, this is different. I think there's no data to suggest that there's an adverse reaction if you stop it. It's not like the steroids suppress the pituitary adrenal axis. To our knowledge, that data is not there.
There's a lot of frustration from quite a few parents who are asking questions about the finances. And, Rosemary has said that parents often fundraise for wheelchairs, which is £18,000. So if costs are an issue, could they help to contribute for staffing or capacity issues? You know, Pete Moran has asked what resources are needed. Is there anything, you know, we can do to help fundraise? Could some of the monitoring be done under general practice to take pressure off of the sites? I feel, yeah, Alex and I get, you know, we understand this frustration from the community, the feeling of well, if it's only money that's getting in the way of my son accessing givinostat, surely something can be done about that.
Yeah, I think theoretically fundraising is possible. I think each one of the trusts will have to see how they would accept it. Then there would be the question that if there's fundraising in an ideal world, it should be for a group of young people rather than for a select young person, for equity's sake. I think that is one. Emily, the second part. So I think this option will probably be explored further. If, for example, the trusts come out and say we cannot do it, this is something that, again, sometimes there are models of joint funding and so forth. So one can look at it. But my preference will be to try to get NHS to deliver on this. I think there was a second part. Oh, getting the GPs to do the blood test. I think you may have experienced that GP surgeries are very good with dealing with adults' blood tests. Most GP surgeries that I know of, they do not have the expertise of doing children's blood. So for children's blood, they often have to go to the local hospital or a special setup. The other thing is, because many of these are fasting bloods, there's a risk that the district general hospitals or the GP surgeries, they may say this is unfunded activity in EAP. The main trust should bear this. We are not going to bear it. Now, I hope people won't get down to this degree of, which part of money the money is coming from. But that is the limitation with GP blood tests.
I mean, the capacity issue is incredibly frustrating, you know, and I think, you know, through Duchenne UK and Joining Jack, we've funded nearly £4 million worth of posts at Great Ormond Street and Newcastle at all the 11 hub sites, and clinical trial capacity has increased. So it's incredibly frustrating to now learn that on the eve of one, certainly, and potentially two new treatments for Duchenne, that there isn't the capacity within the sites to deliver it. And, you know, this seems to me to be a systemic issue that we have to keep campaigning on, you know, beyond the approval of givinostat. So there was a question about non-ambulant patients. And I think both you and I discussed that, Adnan, earlier. I think if the MHRA give a broad label, so if they say that boys can take givinostat regardless of their age or their ambulatory status, we then have to wait for NICE to make a decision about what they will or will not fund on that. And as Will alluded to earlier, those timelines unfortunately stretch into next year. But the main focus right now, I think, is for us all to really hope that the MHRA give givinostat a broad label. And then that really makes the next steps along the pathway a lot easier. Will, Alex, do you want to pick up on some questions? I feel like everyone must be getting bored of me talking now.
And as you know, in the United States, the label is just above 6 years.
The label is just above 6 years, and the FDA made that decision even though the clinical trial was only on patients who were ambulant. And yeah, I think that was a really good example of safe regulatory flexibility to allow ambulant and non-ambulant boys to access it. Will, could you want to pick up on some questions? Was there one from Tony at the top?
Yes, there was a question from Tony. In fact, well, Tony, I'll make you a participant so you can ask that question yourself. Give me 1 second, I'll make you into a panelist. Here we go. Tony's coming back in as a panelist.
Hi, Tony, can you hear us?
Ah, there we go. I work in IT and I should know to press the mute button. My apologies.
Fire away.
Okay, well, it's been a thing for the questions. Just let me recollect. There's been some really good points tonight from everyone. I mean, the guys, obviously, firstly, really appreciate all of the work you've done. It's amazing, and I know how long it's actually taken to get here to have these great opportunities for us. Is it your opinion that all of the work that we're going to do now with the MPs, with the lobbying, with writing to the MHRA, will actually help to pave the way for the future drugs to come through?
I think as far as I'm concerned, I think that is what canvassing is about, and that's how you form the opinion. So that will be most helpful. I think I remember the days when Etalauren was being considered by NICE, and many families put in a lot of effort, and I think that was beneficial. So this lobbying, pressure, advocacy, this certainly would help.
Yeah,
I mean, in the next few years, we've got a lot more drugs, hopefully, to come through. I think it's essential that we all begin now to communicate, especially as the Parliament's new, with all of our MPs, with all of the pressure, because this is now the time that we've all dreamed of to get these new drugs through. So, you know, I believe this is just the start of the process.
Definitely.
Yeah, and what I'd add to that, Tony, is that we've not had an early access program like this in Duchenne before, and we've really raised awareness that these free of charge schemes exist. That trusts need to be prepared for them if they come along, and I think if a free of charge scheme like this comes along in the future, we won't have nearly as many administrative problems as we did this time around for givinostat.
Yeah, I agree. I think the problem with the EAP is it doesn't fall into anybody's job description to deliver it. It doesn't fall under research with the clinical research facility, and it isn't part of people's jobs working within the NHS to deliver it. So it's kind of who does it. And I think that's something that, when we meet with Wes Streeting and other people, we need to discuss, because there needs to be a pathway made available. Because I think, as a country, we like to make great big speeches saying that we are the world leaders and the NHS is amazing and we deliver innovative treatments. And actually, we're not we're failing, and it needs to be looked at and addressed.
I think you're absolutely right, Alex. And I'm going to make the most of having you here, Adnan. And there's just one last question. Is there any possibility that givinostat could become available on the EAP with relaxed criteria, for example, removing the time up from the floor?
I think if MHRA gives a broader label, that might be a bit different, but as things stand, the EAP legally has to mirror what the clinical trial was. So in the immediate term, I think it is difficult to foresee. Now, if the MHRA gave a much bigger approval for all age groups, whether there would be an added pressure and whether the EAP could be amended, eventually the amendment of the EAP is in the hands of Italfarmaco, the manufacturer. The clinicians are there to agree and to prescribe. The decision of how many children and what stage of children they give it is partly their legal obligation to mirror the clinical trial, partly to mirror the clinical need and what the country's MHRA has approved.
Okay, well, we're actually on the dot of 8 p.m. So Adnan, thank you very much indeed for giving up your time for that excellent presentation and for answering all the questions. Thank you to Will for organising this. Massive thank you to Alex and to Jack, of course, always the star. And to remind you, we're having our parliamentary event on the 22nd of January. I think Adnan was very clear, and I think we're all seeing that as a community we can make change and we can have power. And it reminds me of a quote that actually June Rain, who's the CEO of MHRA, once said, which was, if you want to go fast, go alone. But if you want to go far, go together. And I think what we're doing as a community is going far together. We're building the groundwork and we're paving the way for a new dawn with new treatments for Duchenne muscular dystrophy. So thank you all very much for listening. Thank you for your questions, and keep your eyes out for our next newsletters on givinostat. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye-bye, and thanks very much. Thank you.